What's up, Data Transformers? This is Bolaji, and welcome to Data Career Transformations, the show where we watch analytics engineers, data analysts, and data scientists transform their career. Today, we're talking to your favorite data pro's favorite data pro. She's the baby of 6 kids, studied for a year in Cape Town, South Africa, studied political science and government in college, studied Italian culture and speaks Italian. She lived out of a van named Bessie. She's the author of the riveting Substack, A Search for Meaning, and was, for a time, the legendary head of data at DBT Labs. Wait, she had the ring of power, the coveted head of data position, and voluntarily let it go? Oh, hell no! I gotta hear this story. From DBT Labs to BuzzFeed, back to DBT Labs, please help me welcome the former head of data, now senior analytics manager at DBT Labs, Erica, Rick, Louie. What up, Erica?
All right, so this is going to be a fun and fascinating conversation with Rick. I want to know your origin story because, disclaimer, I grew up a fiction nerd, reading a lot of comic books. I'm very much into people's origin stories. Plus, I just love learning how did you become this superhero, right? You didn't even study data back in the day. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to the world of data?
Yeah, gosh, what a loaded big question. How do I make this super concise? I think that being the youngest of 6 kids, where your 5 siblings are the smartest kids in class, all the teachers accidentally call you your sister's names. I wanted to be different. I also have very thick skin now because of that, but I would see what they would do and I would just be like, I want to be a pastry chef. And so I told myself if I didn't get into my early decision, I was going to go to pastry school. But I did. And I was like, all right, well, I'm now in college, and I switched my major 5 times. All of my friends were really go-getters, pre-professional school, and I was just like, I just want to choose something that fits around my life because I wanted to put my happiness first. And I was between 2 job decisions where I was either going to be a videographer for a nonprofit that would interview artists around Philadelphia, or I was going to work at DBT Labs as a data person. But I was like, I just want to be able to enjoy my life. And I was doing an internship where they would bring international students to the school. And I went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, was staring at this painting of Monet, and this woman comes over to me. And she was like, honey, you've been looking at that painting all day. What's going through your mind? I told her I was deciding between these 2 routes. And she was like, honey, I've been an artist in Philadelphia for 40 years. Your art will always be there. Yeah. And I really chose data because the nonprofit that I wanted to work at wasn't going to pay me a livable wage. And I really just wanted to sit at my computer, listen to music, and be able to potentially work out of a van. And I was like, what job will allow me to do that? I ended up at then Fishtown Analytics as a second employee. Now I'm here and I love data.
Wow. That's wild. That is wild. A lot of the colleagues that I've spoken to didn't have a traditional path into the data profession either. Yours is maybe one of the most far-flung that I've heard. You were an artist and now you are in data. Some people would say it's hard to have those 2 skill sets. Do you feel like you always were an analytical person, or did you just sort of build those skills along the way?
Yeah, I wouldn't say analytical in the sense of like math was my worst subject. I did HTML on Neopets and Zanga, but
wow,
I would see the stories behind things and understand the context by just picking up these qualitative data points. I just worked my entire life. I've always had side jobs. And so for this role, I was just like, I could probably do that. And data is really just seeing the stories and seeing the context. Yeah. And so I think that that's why I like this so much. I think anyone can be a data person because if you can just infer points around your life or make stories based off of those little pieces, then You could be a data person.
That's wild. And we're going to talk quite a bit. I appreciate you sharing this. You've always been pretty transparent, actually, with not only your career journey, but what's going on in your life around your career. As I mentioned, folks, Erica is a beautiful writer. She has a Substack titled A Search for Meaning. It's a worthwhile read. So you've always sort of given us insight into what's going on. I made this allusion at the beginning of the conversation to the one ring of power. This reminds me of the whole Frodo's whole journey to get the ring of power, and how in our careers, whether we're a data person or we are data adjacent, we all have this vision for our careers. We see that pinnacle, whether it's CMO or head of data, whatever the title is. And particularly when we're earlier in our career, Rick, we're like, one day I'm going to get to the top of the mountain. You got to the top of the mountain, Rick. You made it. And yet, Rick, somehow things transpired to where you voluntarily decided not to continue to stay at the top of that mountain. If the game is Queen of the Hill, you voluntarily took the crown off. Like, what is she doing? We're going to get there, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So that's sort of a precursor. Why don't we start a bit closer to the beginning, Rick, of one's career journey? So there are people on the call today, data professionals, who are trying to climb that mountain. Could we talk a little bit about some of the skill sets or milestones that were useful in helping you climb from an individual contributor to eventually getting that head of data role?
Yeah. I'll be honest, I never wanted to be a data leader in the space. It was more so Tristan saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, because I was like, I want to see if I want to be an ML engineer. I'm going to work at this bigger company and strive towards that. But the thing that really had set like me in terms of like my skill sets was one being like just wanting to help and coming from like a place of like empathy and full transparency. So I would say like, I don't really know this. I'm worried about this. Is this how you do this? And just like being open to feedback, I think that like, going from an IC to then being a manager, you have to understand that it's not about the title. It's about, do you want to help people with their careers? Like, what's the meaning behind like you doing this? I really like mentoring people. I like talking about the bigger picture and the strategies. I like live in my head more than I live in like my reality. But in terms of other skill sets, it's from the hard skills of being able to see things from like granular to like 100-foot view of like, okay, we're doing this, but what's the meaning behind this? What are we actually trying to be striving for here? And then communicating it outward. Like, I think this could be improved, or we're working on this, but have we considered this? And also just meeting folks in the community too was huge for me. You can only know as much as your career as to what you've experienced. And so it's important to reach out to other leaders that you admire, and just ask for a coffee chat. Those things are like super key. And also awareness. I don't mean to humble brag, but I think a lot of people enjoy working with me because I don't take anything too seriously, where I'm trying to have a fun, engaging conversation, and getting to know the person and then understanding what are the pain points. And so more people are willing to like rope me into conversations, if I'm being like fully honest.
This is an interesting perspective that you're sharing, and I appreciate you putting that on the table. Could you talk a bit about like when you're hiring for a data professional on your team, how are you balancing these hard skills and soft skills to choose the person that's going to fill the role?
Yeah, for the hard skills, it depends on like the role it is. For an analytics engineer, it's like, are you just thinking about the end result, or are you actually thinking about the processes and the system to get there and what you're actually building for long term? So for example, if I ask, hey, can you take all this data and make an orders table? And then they just have all of the raw data, like raw sources, like referenced in one giant like model, but not thinking about how these things build up or thinking about long-term scale. That is the thing where it's, you're just doing it to do the end result, but you're not thinking about what the meaning is behind, like when you model these things out, do you over-index on just documentation? And what is your thought process as you're building these things out? It's the same thing for a data analyst, where I give them like a vague question and they don't ask me additional context questions. They just ride off of assumptions that they don't communicate outward. And they don't talk about testing and verifying what those end results are, as well as like, how do you write SQL? It's like building a bike shed, but there are more optimized ways to build a bike shed. Like, do you have comments in like this query? How have you interacted with other counterparts and your stakeholders? Data analyst is especially hard because you have to like talk to your stakeholders and kind of like understand the context and the reason why behind it. That's from like a hard skilled perspective. And then the soft skills, what sets apart a good data practitioner and a great one is empathy. You can get mad as much as you want about all these reactive stakeholder requests, but trying to understand where they're coming from and communicating the things that they're going to need because you can understand their perspective is so vital. It's a lot harder to have impact if people don't want to work with you and don't want to include you in conversations.
Tell me how true these ring. The statement, data can be a thankless job, or the statement, data can be order taking instead of being consultative. Is that a reality for some of our data counterparts?
Oh my God, we're definitely not ticket intake monkeys at all. We're very much so partners with our embedded folks. Thankless could be in terms of people are always going to want more and they don't really quite understand the process that it takes to get there. Now, I don't feel like any of our work that we do feels like it's like thankless work. I think it's sometimes hard work for sure, but it's important also to communicate that outward.
Goodness, that's powerful right there. The fact that an executive in a board meeting could, on a whim, ask a data question and then not realize that your team is spending 20 hours or 30 hours coming up with the answer, only to have them be like, oh, interesting. And then they don't really do anything with the data. Maybe they didn't realize how much work you were putting in to give them that response in the first place.
Yeah. Earlier in my career as head of data, that's what I initially felt like. Like, we were small team, high output. It was crazy how much we were doing. But the thing that you always have to ask is like, okay, if you were to know this, what would you do with it? And I always communicate like, okay, this specific question that you want is going to take more time. And then if like you're able to kind of deduce it down to like, okay, you actually want to know this. I think that that's the art behind the science.
Yeah. But I'm imagining that the experience could be quite varied depending on where in the ecosystem people fit.
Yeah, it's different at every company. For example, our solution architects, we call them field engineers, or some folks call them sales engineers. At DBT, they're essentially analytics engineers that talk about some of like the more technical problems that our customers are facing, and explain alternative ways of doing it, and explaining the more in-depth product experiences. I have so much respect for anyone who is external facing. External facing is such a hard role. I love having internal facing where like my coworkers are my customers. Sometimes I would just hold my breath when I go into customer calls and I'm like, what the heck is going to happen now?
I love it. I want to hear some of the nightmare stories, some of the failures, some of the really hard experiences, data projects that didn't go well. Do you have any of those in your backpack, Rick?
About data experiences that didn't go well?
Yes. We want all the tea.
Well, it was December 2022, and I will never forget this, where one of our sales leaders, they're asking about customer mapping and how it was off. And I was like, okay, we're going to put this in our backlog. I was so overwhelmed at the time and like kind of was like, okay, we can address this next month. But then they went on scheduled a 15-minute sync with me. And as an anxious person, I was like, oh no. And then they were just like, these are all the problems I'm experiencing by not having this thing. This is what my sales folks are like struggling with. And I was like, I logged off and I just broke down crying. And so it was at a time where I wasn't good about prioritizing the backlog. I was just ticket intaking. And the thing that didn't go well was that I wasn't in on those conversations. I didn't really ask the friction points or the impact of it. And it's like a classic thing. And I don't look back at that with any ill feelings. If anything, one of my old managers were like, this is an experience where your thought process and the action things that you took afterwards were correct. And as much as this hurts, you'll never forget it. And it's true. It's all of those things you don't forget, but you don't let it weigh on you as a failure. So yeah, it was just not really being involved in those conversations early on or understanding and having empathy for what they were going through.
I mean, Rick, she came up with the date right away, like December 2022. It was a dark and stormy night.
Oh, the darkest night in New York City.
It just took us right into the moment. Man, I felt that. I've been in some service type positions in the past, whether internal or external, throughout my career. And goodness, those type of calls can be tough, especially when the call has been scheduled. You know they're going to talk about the bad news, but how you build from that moment, goodness, I think you really use it as a stepping stone versus a weight or a millstone to hold you down. So kudos to you and to your former manager.
Thank you. Yeah, it was like, is this going to be my hero origin story or my villain origin story? As you come to a fork in the road.
That's too good. Yeah. So I mentioned I used to read comic books quite a bit. Okay, I lied. I still read comic books quite a bit. We all gotta have a vice. All right. But, yeah, you know, now superheroes are kind of cool now. When I was a kid, not so much, but there's this interesting framing. I just sort of like them because they're like modern mythology. And there was this really interesting framing. If anyone's familiar with DC Comics, so we all probably know Batman. So Batman's nemesis, most famous nemesis, is the Joker. And so the Joker came up with this concept. I promise this is going to relate to data. He came up with this concept of one bad day. And his theory was, let's talk like data professor. His hypothesis was, this is actually like a data problem. His hypothesis was that anyone could be a hero or a hero, but all it takes is for them to experience one really bad day for them to become a villain. And so he wanted to prove that Batman could be just as bad as himself, the Joker. And so he went about to helping Batman, very kindly, helping Batman to have a really, really bad day, you know, kidnapping all of Batman's loved ones and so on and so forth. This sounds like your one bad day moment, and you were able to flip it into a positive thing. We could chuckle about this, but a lot of us are going to have a number of these moments throughout our careers. You shared one, Rick, that really moved me on your blog. You wrote it about a year ago, and you wrote about being the head of data. Now we're getting into it, folks. You talk about being the head of data and experiencing a whole lot of overwhelm. Would you mind taking us back to that moment?
Yeah, sure. When I was hired as head of data, I just straight up told Tristan, I realized that you're hiring a 25-year-old to be a head of data at DBT Labs. And he was like, we'll figure it out. I had always echoed to him, I do not want to be a VP. The thing that I enjoy is like working with my team and working with people. That role has never appealed to me. I didn't come back to be a head of data. If anything, I just came back for the people. And so throughout the time where I was head of data, I had told Tristan like a year into it, we could probably start hiring someone else to be my manager and take over. But the thing that was really hard for me to let go of was like, I loved my team so much and I loved the culture that I had built. I deeply feared like that someone would come in and like kind of like, to excuse my French, but like fuck it up, you know, and just like take it all away from me. And so,
that's real.
And I mean, 2023 was a hard year for everybody. And especially for data teams, like trying to crunch numbers, it was tough. And so I was just under a lot of stress. I didn't feel joy in my work. I was seeing my team get really stressed out and wanted to reiterate to everybody, like, you know, I have been in this role and I feel like there are other people that have had so much tenure because I'm working off of first principles. And I don't really have an acting manager because Tristan's the CEO, he was my manager, and there's only so much time that he could give me. And so when I sat down and really thought about what I enjoyed about my work, because I was also thinking about moving to being an IC again. I was like, the things that give me joy is being able to run my team in this way and being able to look at different ways of, how do we move strategically? How do we framework things? What are some repeatable things going on? And so I was like, I still want to manage people. And if there comes a time where someone else could do my role better, then I'm I'm not tied to it. And if I don't want to manage people anymore, I want to be an IC, then I can do that. I was always worried more so of how would my team feel? And they were just so supportive about it. And I was really lucky because I got to hire my boss. Alex was the first data leader to ever reach out to me when I first started as head of data, where he wanted to know my opinion. And so it was this crazy 2-year later full circle moment when he applied. And now our team culture is still really great. I love having a manager. I love not having to be in those high leadership meetings and then feel like I'm flying off the seat of my pants. And yeah, it was a great decision. And I'm really grateful for, still being able to manage, still being at this company.
That's powerful. I've just got to say, I feel like that took a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-acceptance too, because goodness, we've all been there, right? Maybe you're on the job market or you're trying to move up in the world, and we not only try to put our best foot forward, we almost try to hide the aspects of ourselves that aren't our greatest strengths, but those get exposed. Nobody is great at everything. I really value the fact that you were comfortable in what you were good at and what gave you joy in your work. And you're I want to make my way back to that. I think that's so valuable.
Yeah. And when you're in the weeds every day, a lot of people don't do self-check-ins with themselves. Now I can feel when I'm starting to feel stressed or overwhelmed, and every day I'll do a quick summary of my day where I'm what did I do? What have I been thinking about? And what was the most significant thing that happened? If I didn't have those check-ins with myself now, I think I would just be miserable. And that's the thing I always tell people whenever they're applying for a job or thinking about moving up and going into management. One, really look at the people that you're speaking to. Look at the leaders. Are those leaders the type of people that you want to help push that vision and support them? And do you actually like what those things are? Or what are the things in your current role that you enjoy? And if it's still doing things I worked on this crazy modeling project, and now our runtime runs in third as much, and all these other technical things. And it's okay, well, I don't know if you actually want to be a manager. Maybe you want to be a lead. That's an important differentiation. Just being really honest with yourself and leaning into your feelings.
I could tell you mentor people a lot. Because this feels like a career mentoring session. I'm I should be paying Rick for this. This is good. I'd love it if you could talk about this question. How do we know we're doing data well? How do you measure your value? Is it SLA time? Rick is laughing. Is it time to insights? What does good look like, Rick? Help us out.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I laugh because that's such a classic thing with data teams. From an analytics engineering side, I would say uptime is a big one. You can talk about output of models, but that doesn't really mean anything because you can build 1,000 GPT models doesn't mean that they're good. But from a general perspective, one of the things that we started doing now is we link all of the projects that we're doing to company level initiatives. And so when we contribute to those things, then we can say, okay, this work that we did linked to this and helped move this, that's linked to this company OKR. That's more tied closely. One of the other things is when leaders go into meetings, do they have a dashboard that they're pulling up constantly? What are your most used assets? Folks loop you into conversations, and how integrated are you with them? Some of it's sentiment of your coworkers, but a lot of it objectively is look at all these things that we have created that are used constantly are actually helping move productivity, because there are a lot of dashboards that we have created that help people be more productive in their job. So
I love that. And I don't know if the dots are connected, Rick, but the fact that your background was a little bit more on the arts side, I feel like you connect the two sides of the brain so well. I love that at DBT Labs, for example, most of the data professionals are embedded with different parts of the business. Those are interesting ways to measure value for a data team.
Yeah. Data teams, as they scale up, become a very expensive cost center. And so it's sometimes hard to justify where we add value. And so making sure that your leaders are like really knocking that home, and that you can also speak about your work's impact. I think that's really important for ICs to know the impact of your work.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. I want to ask about data governance, because I think that's something a lot of companies struggle with.
Data governance is like this piece of a bigger pie. We don't have like a lot of like data tooling that's like growing rapidly around data governance. At our company, we actually have created our own like custom like masking process, like custom macros to mask certain data. So for example, our people ops team, they're the only folks that are allowed to see personal employee data. Same thing for our finance team, etc. And so there are a lot of ways that you can do that in DBT. And if anything, that's also something that we have with Mesh, where you can like make certain models like private or public. But in terms of like dynamic masking policies, that's something that like we've created a macro for, and we're trying to like get our product, our PMs to incorporate that into our product. Yeah. There are a lot of DBT features that we were the pioneers for, like micro batching, incremental models. That was us.
Nice. Okay. I appreciate that. Deep is asking, Rick, if you could talk about efficient data transformation using DBT.
It depends on like what your definition of efficient is. If we're talking about model runtime, one of the things that we started doing, because our project has like 100 models right now, we're like meshifying it. But efficiency is like, how fast do you need this data? Or is it okay if this model takes 30 minutes to run? Is that okay? That's where like things like incremental models come in. It's so much easier to have steps with it. Like if you have this giant model, how do you actually just take all of those nested logic and actually break it down into the sum of its parts? That actually allows you to do more like, these are all the steps it takes to then get into this bigger one. And so that's much more of an efficient perspective, and also better for brain space too. Like being able to kind of like work backwards from what are the entities that you care about? What are the actions that those entities do? And then working backwards of like, where are those sources coming from? Do we need to do an incremental approach? Should we do some cold storage on it? Because for event models, you don't need to full refresh those models if they are like a month old. Just like cold storage.
Gotcha.
That's what they are. But things like that are important considerations, like the way you materialize them. Should they be tables? Should they be views? And like, yeah, I think that's when it gets a little bit more nested into like warehousing conversations. And do you snapshot to like the left or to the right of your pipeline? And my gut is always snapshotting as early as possible, closest to the source. So that way you can see the way that things change as you're going through the steps of where did things break down. The only time where I say that snapshotting to the right is helpful is that if you're snapshotting metrics where definitions might change over time, it's important to have that as a point in time reference. But as early as possible in the DAG is something that I recommend. We mostly snapshot our source tables.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions in Slido. So I'm going to slide over there and ask those questions as well to you, Rick. Here's one. It says, would you ever recommend a team org brand new to DBT to start with a multi-project DBT mesh right from the start? What conditions would you consider?
Oh my goodness. Okay. This is a great question. I would say don't start with mesh first. The thing that's appealing about it is for companies that have like over 1,000 models, hence why like we're meshifying our project. Start off with the core things that you need. What are the core like entities that you're measuring? What do folks need to see repeatedly that are critical? And then working backwards from there, because then you're going to see, okay, you have these core models that represent each org. And then as your project develops, you can kind of see the way that some of the parts of the DAG start splitting off. And when it starts splitting off a huge chunk of it, that's when it's like, okay, this should actually be a mesh project. If you have multiple data pods, like for example, we're a hybrid approach between EPD, go-to-market, and corp. And there's some like very core things that we need that represent for the entire business that everyone's going to need to touch. But then like corp, which is like finance and stuff, they're going to have like their own separate mesh project because they have specific permissions. We don't need to run that entire huge DAG. It could be separated. And so that's when you start thinking about meshifying. But keep that in your mind too. Always have your DAG represent your business.
Yes. All right, Rick, if you had to build a data team from scratch without having executive buy-in at the beginning, that's the key part, what would your 1 year and your 5 year plan be?
I would go to the execs and say, per exec, like, what do you need? What's like a repeatable reporting that you need? What do we report to the board? What do you need to see? And if they give me this long list of like whatever, then I would say, okay, then we need to be able to build these things with this capacity. We'll only be able to do this. If we're structured in this way, then we'll be able to accomplish all of these, but it depends on like what your prioritization is. And then that's when I would start like hiring people out depending on that business need. But then in terms of like the 5-year trajectory conversations too, if we're having those same conversations that day, it would be like, where do you see the business scaling? Like, what are the upcoming like big bets that we're taking? And then saying like, okay, then we're going to need to invest data sources in like this resources in this area. And I really believe in you need to first do the foundations, which feels more services, but that is a jumping off point to then being more as partners. I feel very strongly about data teams being semi-embedded because you can't hold all of the knowledge of the entire business in your head. And it's really hard to build relationship with stakeholders. And so I would also say that like I would want our team to grow into being a hybrid embedded model.
This is fascinating. You've talked before, Rick, about the concepts of data as a service versus data as a product. Should data teams fulfill the traditional service desk function? And if so, how can they do that while not losing out, investing time into strategic projects? How are data teams managing this balance?
Yeah, it's a really hard adjustment to have to make. One of the things that I would suggest is having at least like you or like another IC kind of like hold space. You can have all the tasks in your backlog. And then you can say like, we're going to hold 2 sprint points to doing this independent exploration for every like data analyst or like, and also having like tech debt days. And then you can then show that analysis or like what the output of that tech debt day was to your execs and leaders and say, this is like an example. And then their eyes will light up. They'll then see what it means if you were actually looking at things strategically. That's an example. If like if you're like pushing for it and they're just like not hearing it out, or talking to the leaders and saying, we're focused on these business areas. Like before you build a dashboard, one always first do an analysis to determine whether or not like these are the things that we need. Otherwise, we're just going to keep churning out metrics that don't mean anything. For us, we hired AEs first to do the foundational modeling. And then as we were getting to a good point, then you hire a data analyst to then say, okay, let's start running with some analyses and utilizing these models.
Yeah. That's really good. That's really good. This has been a lot of fun. Let's see if we can close it out with one more question for Rick. This is not going to be data related, but Rick, I want to know about Bessie. Who is Bessie? What happened to her?
Oh my God. Bessie was my converted Chevy Express van. She drove me across New York all the way down to California. I named her Bessie. She had a bed in her. She had a sink, and she was my converted van that I like moved across the country in. And I named her Bessie because for my first road trip across the U.S., I wanted to only see world's largest statues. And there's a cow in North Dakota called Salem Sioux. She's a giant Holstein cow. And with Bessie right next to her, I was like, this is my cow van. So I named her Bessie. And then I lived in it part-time for a year. And then I had to sell her when I moved to Los Angeles because I couldn't fit her anywhere.
Do you know where she ended up? Is she still in LA?
I don't know. I had to sell her. So I don't know where she ended up, hopefully to a good home. But I would do it all again. I think I want to get a smaller converted car eventually.
This is phenomenal. I put the link to Erica's blog post a little bit earlier, her blog in Substack a little bit earlier, so please do check it out. Subscribe. She hasn't written there in about a year.
I have a draft. I have a draft that I'll be posting at the end of the month.
We want more. The public is clamoring for more Erica. So Erica, beyond being a data professional, is very much a human, and she shares that. I hate to bring it to a close, but you all got to get back to work. Erica, thank you for being so generous with your time. This was great. I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for hanging out, folks. We'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.
This show is brought to you by DBT. DBT is the industry standard for data transformation. It allows your team to prepare data for analysis in a way that's centralized, modular, and entirely open, all inside your cloud data platform. The outcome? Consistently dependable analytics for your organization. Now, the DBT community was built for and by data pros. Come hang out and transform with 70,000 of the brightest analytics engineers, data analysts, and data scientists in the world. With DBT, you transform your data. With the DBT community, you transform your data career.